Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So today we're reading from the Srimad Bhagavatam. We're beginning chapter 8, which is called Prayers of Queen Kunti and Pariksit Saved. A very, very wonderful chapter. It has the prayers of Queen Kunti. It has a discussion of Yudhisthira and his lamentation and how Krishna relieves that, and also how Pariksit is saved in the womb from the Ashvatthama's Brahmastra weapon. So, great chapter. We begin with the, we are doing three texts, so I'm going to read through text 1 and 2, and then we'll do 3 responsively, which is the main purport. Okay, so I'll just read. Sutuvacha tate samparetanam svanam udakam ichchitam datum sakrishna gangayam purushkritya yayushtriya. Suta Goswami said, thereafter the Pandavas, desiring to deliver water to the dead relatives who desired it, went to the Ganges with Draupadi. The ladies walked in front. Today it is the custom in Hindu society to go to the Ganges or any other sacred river to take bath when death occurs in the family. Each of the family members pours out a pot full of Ganges water for the departed soul and walks in a procession with the ladies in front. The Pandavas also followed this rule more than 5,000 years ago. Lord Krishna, being a cousin of the Pandavas, was also among the family members. Text 2. Tenani yodakam sarve vilapya cha brisham puna apluta haripadhabja Rajaputta Sarijjale. Having lamented over them and sufficiently offered Ganges water, they bathed in the Ganges, whose waters sanctified due to being mixed with the dust of the lotus feet of the Lord. So text 3, we can chant. Titrashinam Kurupatim Dhritarashtram Sahanujam Gandharim Putra Gandharim Putra Sokartam Kritam Krishnam Shamadhava Tatrashinam Karupatim Dhritarashtram Sahanujam Gandharim Putra Sokartam Kritam Krishnam Chamadhava. Others chant. Tatrashinam Kurupatim Dhritarashram Sahanujam Gandharim Putra Sokartam Kritam Krishnam Chamadhava. Vaishnavis? Tatrashinam Kurupatim Dhritarashram Sahanujam Gandharim Putra Sokartam Kritam Krishnam Chamadhava. Tatra, there. Asinam, sitting. Kurupatim, the king of the Kurus. Dhritarashtra, Saha Anujam, with his younger brothers. Gandhari, Putra, son. Shoka Artam, overtaken by bereavement. Kritam, Kunti, Krishnam, Draupadi, Cha, also, Madhava, Lord Sri Krishna. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada. There sat the king of the Kurus, Maharaj Yudhisthira, along with his younger brothers and Dhritarashtra, Gandhari, Kunti, and Draupadi, all overwhelmed with grief. Lord Krishna was also there. Purport. The battle of Kurukshetra was fought between family members. And thus all affected persons were also family members, like Maharaj Yudhisthira and his brothers, Kunti, Draupadi, Subhadra, Dhritarashtra, Gandhari, and her daughter-in-laws, etc. All the principal dead bodies were in some way or other related with each other, and therefore the family grief was combined. Lord Krishna was also one of them as a cousin of the Pandavas and nephew of Kunti, as well as brother of Subhadra, etc. The Lord therefore was equally sympathetic toward all of them, and therefore he began to pacify them befittingly. Om Jnana-tivrandasya Gyananjana Salakaya Chaksulamitamina Tasma Shri Gurve Namaha Panchakalpatarubhishcha Kripasendu Devicha Patitano Pavnebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. So we can hardly imagine the scene as they're there basically looking over the battle of Kurukshetra. And so many millions and millions of people have been killed, and what to speak of the principal family members on both sides. And of course, as mentioned here, the Pandavas and the others are all related. They're related to many on both sides of the battle because, of course, Pandu and Dhritarashtra were brothers. So Pandu's sons, the Pandavas, were the cousins of Duryodhana and all of his brothers. And so all of these relatives, so many of these relatives were killed. And not only relatives, but many were great devotees. Even Bhishma Dev, Dronacharya, so many great devotees were also killed. So all of the Pandava children were killed, basically. And all of Gandhari and Dhritarashtra's 100 sons were killed. So you can just imagine this is a very traumatic situation. We can hardly imagine, and as Prabhupada says here, the combined grief of all the families was there. Now, on top of all of that, Yudhisthira is feeling particularly heartbroken because he feels responsible. He feels all of this killing, these millions of people were killed because of me. Because basically the result of the battle was that the Pandavas were victorious and Yudhisthira becomes installed as the king, as the emperor. So in other words, he's saying for all of this, somehow for me to become king, this had to happen. And of course, he's such a moral and person that this is just overwhelming to him. And of course, Krishna also talks to him, and that comes up later. So there's great grief here, which is totally not only understandable, it would be expected. One would have to be heartless, to not feel some grief at this terrible situation. But yet the grief that they're experiencing is really not just ordinary mundane grief. These are great devotees, eternal associates of the Lord. So it's a little bit different. These are devotees of Krishna. They're fully conversant with the philosophy. They understand their spiritual nature. They understand that they're not their bodies. But not only are they feeling, like Yudhisthira is the responsibility and all of this carnage and, everything that happened, they're also feeling the sorrow of separation. And that feeling of separation is a very natural feeling for devotees. When we lose an associate, when we lose a god brother, a god sister, or any devotee, we feel this. We feel this separation. Just as we sing often on disappearance days, Narottam says, "Se Saba Sangira Sange Jakola Balas, Se Sanganapaya Kande, Narottamadas." Being unable to obtain the association of Lord Gauranga, accompanied by all these devotees in whose association he performed his pastimes, Narottam Das simply weeps. So it's a natural feeling. It's a natural feeling to feel some grief, some sadness, some lamentation on the disappearance of wonderful devotees that one has had the Sangha, had the association with. As we are grieving for these devotees, we're not really grieving for their bodies so much, because we know we're not their body, and not really grieving for the spirit or the Atma, because we know that Krishna takes care of these devotees and awards them a better birth. They're either going to get a very advanced birth in this material world or go back to Godhead or go back to the spiritual world. So that grief is not material in that way. But still, there is the association and the Sangha of those devotees that will be badly missed. Prabhupada talks about this point. This is from Prabhupada's lecture on the disappearance day of his spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Maharaj, in 1977. And it's very well known. It's a very, very nice way that Prabhupada says this. Just like the sun is in the sky, but we see in the morning it appears, in the evening it retires. That is the defect of the eyes. Actually, the sun is always there. So similarly, a Vaishnava, as Krishna comes, Yada Yada Dharmasya Glanir, similarly a Vaishnava means the confidential servant of Krishna. He also comes for some purpose by the order of the master. So their life and Krishna's life, it is the same. There's no question, past, present, future. Nityam. So we have nothing to lament for disappearance. So in an ordinary material way, we do not lament for disappearance. And also, as Prabhupada is saying here, we understand that there's a greater purpose. These devotees have come for a purpose. And we know that Krishna's purpose was to rid the earth of the overburden of demoniac kings. So he had to do that in the Battle of Kurukshetra. And also, Krishna's wrapping up his pastimes, right? He doesn't, I don't know the chronology, how old Krishna is at this point, but it's not that long, much later, that, isn't it, that Krishna, disappears, and then all of his entourage has to also disappear. So he's also wrapping things up. And everyone is going to go back with him to the spiritual world or to their, their eternal places. So, I want to talk a little bit about our understanding of the passing of the body, a devotee's understanding of what death means and what the passage of the body from one to another means. Now, for most people in the material world, there's a great fear of death, and that's natural. Everyone really is afraid to die. Nobody wants to die. Nobody, expects to, hopes to. Well, some people are suicidal, but most people are very concerned. And that fear of death really comes from false ego, our identification with the body. Since we think we're our body, even if we know intellectually that we're the spirit, soul, and not the body, sometimes still that feeling is there. It's not completely broken, that attachment to the body. Because if we knew completely, if we totally realized that we were not the body, there wouldn't be no fear of death. The Srimad Bhagavatam 3:26-16 says, "The influence of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is felt in the time factor, which causes fear of death due to false ego of the deluded soul who is contacted material nature." So the time factor, that means that, time is ticking away. Probably, every second of our life is, in one way you can see it as a second closer to death, if you have a materialistic view at least. So for the non-devotee, the material world is a place of fear, bhaya. The four principles of material life, animal life or human life, if you're not in transcendental consciousness, eating, sleeping, mating, and defending. So by defending is sometimes also called fearing. Prabhupada uses both. So defending or fearing. And the greatest fear that everyone has is the fear of death. And people will do anything to avoid death. They go to extraordinary lengths, spend enormous amounts of money in health care. Not that that's bad, but because people are very concerned about their body and the fear of death. And we can see now everyone is very, very afraid we have a virus that is killing people, about 145,000 in America so far. And I forget, it's close to 600,000 in the world. This is not to be taken lightly. So people obviously want to avoid death, and there are many things that are very fearful in this life. Kamsa is, of course, one of our primary examples. As soon as he heard that his death may be coming, caused by some future eighth son of his sister Devotee, so he wants to kill her immediately, his own sister, and then, of course, he kills all of the sons after that. This is the demoniac mentality. Anything, do any immoral, horrible activity to somehow preserve oneself. So that's the difference between a demon and a devotee, or probably any rational person with a little bit of motive goodness. The view of death actually affects one's life. The materialist sees death as end, therefore do anything to prolong life, or they remain in complete denial and never think about it, right? There are many of those who, that's in the future, I can't really think about it, I don't know what's going to happen. I just try not to think about it, just live every day, one day at a time, just stop and smell the roses, you only go around once, do it with gusto, or whatever that. There's some Nike commercial like that, wasn't there? You all maybe not old enough to remember that one. Anyway, it was this complete materialistic philosophy. You only go around once, so give it, enjoy everything you can. In other words, which is completely the idea that there is no afterlife. there's no soul, etc. So this complete denial is there. And in fact, we have a wonderful story from, I guess it's in the Mahabharat, the story of Yudhisthira. And of course, the story is Yudhisthira sent all his brothers, the Pandava brothers, to go get water. And they didn't come back, one after another. Didn't come back, another one, he didn't come back. So finally, he goes to the lake, sees them all apparently lying dead. And so then what happens is this yaksha appears to him, who apparently killed him, and he says, I'll return them all I'll give you your life if you can answer my questions. So he poses a number of these sort of tricky philosophical questions to Yudhisthira. And Yudhisthira, of course, being, Dharmaraj, the master of Dharma, of religious principles, answers them all perfectly. And one of the most important ones to us, of course, was the yaksha says, what is the most wonderful thing in the world? And Yudhisthira says, the most amazing thing is that even though every day one sees countless living entities dying, he still acts and thinks as if he will live forever. And that's true. This is something we can see. In other words, everyone else around me, my grandfathers, my father, my mother, everyone has died, but I think it won't happen to me. I'm the exception. Actually, even in psychology, they have this an expression for that, or a theory for that. It's mostly it's seen in terms of adolescence. It's called anyway. It's part of the myths that adolescents often have. Of course, people take it on throughout their life, and one of those is the invincibility or the invincibility myth. In other words, you see often young people, they think they'll live forever. I can drink and drive, even though I read about this one and this one. This one was killed in a car accident when they did. It's not going to happen to me. I can do anything. I can get away. You see this with young people. I can do anything. It's not going to happen to me. The invincibility fable. Now, unfortunately, you're supposed to grow out of that. And many people never do. And they continue acting the same way. It'll never happen to them. Now, why do we have this feeling of invincibility? That I will never die? Because we won't. Really, our nature is eternal. Our bodies will die, but the desire for immortality is naturally there because the soul is eternal. And on some level, we know that we should be eternal. We know we shouldn't die. It's not right. There's something very unsettling about that when you think about it. Why should I? In other words, because our consciousness is quite developed in the human form of life, we naturally feel like, how could that consciousness all just suddenly be gone? Because it isn't. So the devotee is known as Amrita. He is deathless. Krishna is deathless, I should say, and the devotee is also deathless. Srimad Bhagavatam 2.6.19 says, deathlessness, fearlessness, freedom from anxiety of old age and disease exist in the kingdom of God, which is beyond the three planetary systems, beyond the material coverings. Srila Prabhupada says in the purport, actually the previous verse, the transcendental nature is described as Amrita. The Supreme Lord is the Lord of immortality. In other words, the Lord is immortal, and because the Lord is immortal, he can award immortality to his devotees. So Prabhupada said, in one birth, one should rectify everything and come to permanent life. This is Krishna consciousness. So this is our business. Yes, we are immortal. Krishna's immortal, we are immortal. We are his parts and parcels. We are meant to return to him in that life of unlimited life. So that fear of death that we talked about that the non-devotee has, very contrasts with devotees. And we can see so many examples. Parikshit Maharaj, what happens with him? He's going to die. He's cursed. And it's described very clearly. He could have counteracted the curse. He had enough tejas. He had great spiritual power. He could have counteracted this little curse by this little Brahmin boy, Sringi. But he didn't. He accepted it. And he knew it was part of Krishna's plan to speak the Srimad Bhagavatam. What's interesting, I've been reading the Brihat Bhagavatamrita again. It's very, very wonderful literature. And of course, Parikshit is speaking the Brihat Bhagavatamrita to his mother Uttara. This is after he's heard the Bhagavatam. He's just got maybe, who knows what, a couple hours left in his life. His mother comes to him and he wants to give her spiritual knowledge. So he speaks about, 1,500 pages of spiritual knowledge to her. So this is the devotee. And we can see so many. Vitrasura. who was in a demon body, but was a devotee. Indra needs to kill him. He's fighting the demons. So he says, okay, yeah, go ahead and kill me. Sits down, he doesn't care, And he preaches to Indra because he's a great devotee. And of course, our greatest personal example of Srila Prabhupada, who was unfearing at the time of death, preaching, writing, trying to translate the Bhagavatam up until his very last days. His concern for his service to Krishna, imparting last words to his devotees, never fearing death, because knowing the eternality of the soul, the devotee doesn't have fear. So the devotee knows that he acts morally in this life. He doesn't try to hurt others to unnecessarily prolong his life or even his own happiness or even his enjoyment. But he also prepares for death. And we prepare for death by how one lives this life. This isn't a, morbid philosophy. We simply live our life in the best way, serving Krishna, and that is our preparation. So Prabhupada said, for one who has taken his birth, death is certain. And for one who is dead, birth is certain. Therefore, in the unavoidable discharge of duty, you should not lament. That's Bhagavad Gita. I didn't have a... Anyone know what verse that is? I didn't write it down. It's in the 2nd chapter, right? Somewhere, maybe? One should not fear death. Rather, one should prepare oneself for the next birth, Prabhupada says. One should utilize one's time in this human form to end the process of birth and death. So our proper preparation for that time of death is what? Remembering Krishna during this life. Bhagavad Gita, now I got it. Bhagavad Gita 8.6. Whatever state of being one remembers when he quits his body, of son of Kunti, that state he will attain without fail. So, where our consciousness is, the time of death is going to dictate the next lifetime, the next body. Prabhupada says, one's thoughts during the course of one's life accumulate to influence one's thought at the moment of death. So this life creates one's next life. If in one's present life one lives in the mode of goodness and always thinks of Krishna, it's possible for one to remember Krishna at the end of one's life. So in other words, our spiritual activity, it's not punya, what's the word? Sukriti, I guess, that positive benefit of devotional service accumulates during our life. And so Krishna naturally helps us to remember in the time of death. Prabhupada says in 4.22.24 purport, Smritya means remembering Krishna always. Life should be molded in such a way that one cannot remain alone without thinking of Krishna. We should live in Krishna so that while eating, sleeping, walking, and working, remain only in Krishna. Our Krishna conscious society recommends we arrange our living so we can remember Krishna. So that's what we do. We try to, as much as possible, we hear the Srimad Bhagavatam, we chant, we hear the names of Krishna 26,000 times, chanting our japa, our 16 rounds every day. We try to serve Krishna, remember Krishna in our service, and this way we'll be able to remember him. The results of Vaidhi Bhakti, mentioned in 11:27:49, give perfection in this life and then attain the spiritual world. It says, by worshiping me through the various methods prescribed in the Vedas, one will gain from me his desired perfection both in this life and the next. So that is the result. So Prabhupada goes on, talks a little bit more about this process of how we can remember Krishna in this lifetime so that we will remember Krishna at the time of death. Prabhupada says, therefore, one must strictly chant the Hare Krishna Mahamantra 24 hours daily. One may have other duties to perform under the direction of the spiritual master, but he must first abide by the spiritual master's order to chant a certain number of rounds. In our Krishna conscious movement, we have recommended that the neophyte chant at least 16 rounds. I don't know what we're supposed to do. I guess we're all neophytes, so we stay at 16 rounds. This chanting of 16 rounds is absolutely necessary if one wants to remember Krishna and not forget him. Of all the regular principles, the spiritual master's order to chant at least 16 rounds is most essential. So, I mean, Prabhupada says it to us over and over and over. We finally get it. We need to chant our rounds. We need to chant Krishna's name because hearing and chanting leads to smarana, remembering. Prabhupada gave us the secret to remembering Krishna daily, chanting 16 rounds. Now it says remember Krishna always, 24 hours a day. Practically speaking, quite difficult for most of us. But Prabhupada says if we chant 16 rounds, if we follow the words of spiritual master, try to serve Krishna to the day, then it's automatically there. In other words, we're not forgetting, even if we think, oh, I may be forgetting Krishna, I'm just doing some activity, some material work, or whatever I have to do, Krishna is still there with us because we're following those orders of the spiritual master, we're chanting our rounds. So when, in fact, the word is satatam, that we have to be constantly or always chanting. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur actually explains that word. He says satatam means that one must remember Krishna daily. He says it's be very discouraging and almost impossible for a neophyte devotee to actually always remember Krishna 24 hours a day. He says, so, but it means that by satatam, it always means every day. In other words, we perform our sadhana, our hearing and chanting daily, then we are remembering Krishna. We're following that instruction. And by the practice of Vaidhi Bhakti eventually leads to constant remembrance. The more that we practice Krishna consciousness, the more it becomes natural, the more it becomes more enlivening within our heart, the more attracted we become to Krishna, and the more that we want to chant Krishna's holy name. And by always chanting Krishna's name and always remembering Krishna, we become perfect in this life. So, what happens to the devotee? Eventually, death comes to all of us. Because we're in this material world, we have these material bodies. Prabhupada said more than once, he says, don't think this won't happen to you. And Prabhupada was, of course, going to the end of his life. He wanted to remind his very young disciples, I think everyone is probably in their 20s at the time, don't think this won't happen to you. It happens to everyone. And I think I've said this several times, but you know, as you become about 70 years old, this whole concept of birth, death, disease, and old age takes on a lot more meaning. We actually begin to realize what it means, old age, disease, and then approaching death. So, but what happens to the devotee? Well, in 101358, which is interesting because this is the very end of the 13th chapter, which was the last chapter that Prabhupada personally translated. So I don't know the chronology, but he must have been not very long, very close to the end when he wrote this. And he said, death is like sleep. He says, we wake and resume our life according to our consciousness. And then in his purport, he quotes the Sanskrit word, Soptostita Nyaya, which means waking and resuming knowledge. So he said it's like you go to sleep, you wake, and you resume that knowledge of who you are, of everything that you had learned, everything that you had achieved. Your devotional life continues. And so you receive a body, Prabhupada says, according to karma, prakriti, and svabhava. Svabhava means our nature. In other words, the nature that we've developed, the work, the karma, or the devotional service that we've done, and of course, prakriti, material nature, this determines our next life. And so, of course, we continue on. Now, for one who's not very spiritually advanced, which is apparently most of us, our memory of past lives is pretty much lost. I mean, you know, some people have occasional remembrances of past lives. You know, that can be there. There can be some, you know, the memories aren't always real clear. Some people have very vivid memories of past lives, but for the most part, people forget. We all forget. And it's described how the trauma of being born and being in the womb and birth basically causes forgetfulness of our past. But the death for a pure devotee is a very different experience. And a verse that I really like that we studied recently, a couple months ago probably, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, this is the story of Narada Muni. Narada Muni is 1.6.27. And this is, of course, the end of Narada Muni's life, his past life before he became the transcendental spiritual spaceman Narada Muni. He says, and so, O Brahman Vyasadeva, in due course of time, I was fully absorbed in thinking of Krishna, and who therefore had no attachments, became completely freed of all material taints, and met with death. as lightning and illumination occur simultaneously. It's a wonderful phrase. To me, this is very encouraging. Of course, Narada is a great devotee. Lightning and illumination occur simultaneously. Prabhupada says, and in due course of time, when a pure devotee is completely prepared, all of a sudden, the change of body occurs, which is commonly called death. And for the pure devotee, such a change takes place exactly like lightning and illumination, which follows simultaneously. That is to say, a devotee simultaneously changes his material body and develops a spiritual body by the will of the Supreme. In other words, almost like no loss of consciousness. You're in a material body, and lightning, flash, illumination, you're in a spiritual body. You're in your spiritual body. Pretty wonderful. Now, if I could only be so advanced to be able to experience that. But even if we're not completely perfect, and that, Prabhupada has assured us, the scriptures assured us, all of these verses, that for the devotee there is no loss of diminution. For the devotee, there's only positive advancement on the progressive path of spiritual life. The very worst thing that can happen to a devotee is you take birth as another devotee, or as Bhagavad Gita says, in a very pious family or a family of devotees. In other words, you get a great opportunity to complete your spiritual life in your next lifetime. And we also have every chance, every opportunity to complete in this lifetime and go back to Godhead. And we have experiences. Our devotees, I think Prabhupada indicated that Jayananda went back to Godhead, and there were devotees who Prabhupada said this. So it's very, very possible it can happen. So for the devotee, no fear, no lamentation. We simply want to work in this lifetime to prepare ourselves by chanting the holy names of the Lord. This is the most important practice for us. Of course, our Sankirtan Yajna is the spiritual practice for this age. I was just thinking of this very, very wonderful kirtan that this morning Adi Kartu is leading about Nam Kirtan. I was just reading in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, the Sanatana Goswami was talking about, they're talking about, each of the talks, all these Brahmins and all the different practices and like that. And Sanatana Goswami, confirms. He says that Nam Sankirtan is the most important practice. He said, and that is the practice which will elevate us out of this material world. And of course, that is what Lord Chaitanya came and delivered to us. So we have this wonderful process given to us by Srila Prabhupada and all the past acharyas and Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to be able to chant, hear about Krishna, and remember Krishna at the time of death. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Any questions, comments?
Thank you, Prabhuji, for the class. I would like to know if somebody doesn't have a attraction towards life, it's not like he wants to die or he's in depression or anything. Mm-hmm. What it is, that state, is it, or related question is, what happens when somebody becomes a pure devotee? Does he start loving his life or being in this body, or what?
That's an interesting question. It's like a different vision. The attraction for material life obviously subsides as one becomes pure. But that doesn't mean that, that a pure devotee goes around, I just hate this. Look, it's all Maya. Look at this materials, look at this everywhere. Sometimes neophyte, that's actually more neophyte. My example, I remember when I was a brand new devotee in 1972 in Chicago, we all loaded into the back of a van, no seats, they threw straw down on the floor to sit on, so that when, we got out to go out and do Harinam, we had a piece of straw stuck to our dhotis and saris. Yeah, it was great. Anyway, the good old days. But, and, we had one senior devotee who had been around maybe a year or two. He was initiated, and he was in charge of our party. And one new devotee was looking out the window. And he said to him, "Don't look out the window, it's all Maya out there." Now I just was thinking at the time, how are we going to keep from looking at anything? We go around like, it didn't make any sense to me, because it doesn't make any sense. What we have to do is we have to change our vision from looking at things in the material world from something for me to enjoy for something to engage in Krishna's service. Or at least to recognize that it's coming from Krishna. Like, I like nature. I like to be outside. I like to be out, and but I try to remember, and I have to make a conscious effort, because we can all become a little enamored, by material beauty. But we have to be thinking. At least I try to think. This is all from Krishna. This is all Krishna's energy, because the material energy is also Krishna's energy. Now that takes some advancement and takes some practice. To remember, the material energy is Krishna's energy, and if it's used in Krishna's service, it actually becomes spiritualized. Mahabharat said that. Our bodies become spiritualized as they are engaged in devotional service. So I guess the idea is, we want to kind of become detached. In fact, it's actually described that one Jiva Goswami, this mentioned one of his purports in the Bhakti Samri's Sindhu, that one has to have some sufficient preliminary degree of detachment to advance in spiritual life. I forget what the verse was. But in other words, you have to be a little bit detached from it. You can't be too attached. But on the other hand, we don't want to be overly adverse, because aversion also can be very negative. That can be a real problem. In fact, they go on to say, this is in the section about Yukta Vairagya in Bhakti Samrita Sindhu, that if one is overly attached to Vairagya, to renunciation, it actually makes one's heart hard. So we don't want to overdo it. We don't want to become overly adverse. We don't want to make our heart hard. At the same time, we see things for what they are. Like sometimes I'm thinking, oh, this is so beautiful out here. And then I remember, oh yeah, every blade of grass is competing with every weed, and the roots are all fighting. It's a hard struggle for existence. It may seem nice on the surface, but you also have to remember what's going on. And at the same time, remember this is from Krishna. Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, all beautiful, mighty, and glorious creations are but a spark of my splendor. So it's a change of vision. I'm sorry, kind of a long answer to your question, but I think it's a very important question. Thank you. Okay, anything else?
I was thinking, art of living is to master art of dying.
Yes.
Then Kamsa, it seems like, I'm not trying to be in Kamsa's side, but I'm saying that he got the benediction from Shiva that nobody can kill. But then Shiva said, well, except your nephew. That time Krishna didn't appear. It was a long time back. So in the Vedic culture, nephew is like a very dear to the uncle. So he did.
Like a son.
Yeah, so he said, okay, no problem. He took it lightly, but then Krishna, God appeared as a nephew. Mm-hmm. And the whole episode is like he's trying to not to die.
Yeah.
What's wrong? I mean, there's nothing wrong in that sense.
In not wanting to die.
Yeah, he didn't want to die. That's why he started killing. I'm not supporting that, but I'm saying that
he killed all his relatives to save his life. Yeah. No, as I said, it's natural to want to preserve one's life. I mean, that's, we have to take these things, kind of like the full picture of them. Like Prabhupada said, we're not foolish. He says, yes, you're not your body, and we don't fear material nature. We don't fear death. He says, Prabhupada said, we don't say, oh, here, tiger, come and eat me. That's how Prabhupada said it. He said, you don't just walk into the street, think, oh, Krishna will save me, and get hit by a bus or something. No, we're realistic. We naturally are attached to this body. We naturally try to preserve the body, but it's also not just out of material attachments. It's also because the body is a vehicle to serve Krishna, right? In other words, the higher consciousness about it say, well, as long as I'm in this body, it has a purpose. Krishna's put me here, and I need to use this body for the purpose of service to Krishna. And we can serve Krishna with our body, with our mind, with our words, with our action, our speech, right? So many ways that this body can be useful. And, even the subtle body, which, Krishna says the mind is our best friend or worst enemy. So it's really about consciousness, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a question from...
No, but I thought you were gonna. But I thought you were gonna say, but Krishna remembered. Kamsa remembered Krishna all the time. I thought you were going there with it. He did, but he remembered him unfavorably.
Yeah. He got ultimately. He got.
Yeah.
Mother, this is from Mother Dusala Dasi. Thank you for your nice class. Will you tell us which verse Prabhupada's purport is about death being like going to sleep and waking up?
Yes. Okay. Well, 1627 was Narada Muni. Oh, but the other one. Okay, it's 10, 13, 58. That's where Prabhupada said death like sleep, wake up, resume life, waking, resuming knowledge. 10, yeah, Prabhupada's last chapter he wrote, 10, 13, 58. Yeah, it's actually, I forget the context, because that was about Brahma stealing the cows. Yes. So I'm not sure what the context, I'm not sure what the context, but that's where it is. Is that it? Okay, all glories to the Prabhupada.